there, travelers. Enra Silver here, and welcome to the very first episode of a new series on my channel called Electrified by Enra. In this series, I won't be talking about glitch techniques, and I won't mention glitch stacks at all. Well, not much at least. This series will focus on logic, power, and switches in No Man's Sky. Now, you may be asking yourself, Enra, what qualifies you to talk about this stuff? The answer is easy. Not a goddamn thing. I have zero training in any sort of real-life electrical who's-its or thingamabobs. I've never built a computer, soldered a motherboard, or anything of the like. I know what an AND gate is and what an OR gate is, but a NAND gate? XOR gate? I know the names but couldn't pick them out of a lineup for the life of me. The smattering of electrical terms I do know I'll cover at the start of any episode that uses them, so we'll all be on the same page. These episodes are not meant for electrical engineers. If you are an electrical engineer, I'll apologize ahead of time. These episodes will probably make your head hurt and wonder how I managed to get myself dressed in the morning. Spoiler alert, the answer to that last question is, I don't. I usually record these episodes in my birthday suit. Don't picture it, it's not pretty. I said don't picture it! So if I'm totally unqualified in every sense of the word to make these episodes, why am I making them, you ask? Well, because when I started getting curious about logic and switches and using them to improve the visuals of my builds, I found plenty of YouTube videos on how to do logic in NMS, but they all made my brain hurt, explaining things at a level beyond my comprehension. So I watched, rewatched, played around with stuff, and asked other NMS players who were much smarter at this than myself to help me understand. 2 players were gracious enough to entertain my idiotic questions. Gecko GT and Paul Holla, thank you for your patience. I will be forever in your debt. Now, I mentioned all the YouTube videos made my head hurt, but there were 2 creators who made my head hurt, but in ways I could at least begin to follow. Beeblebum was instrumental in not only getting me into glitch building, but showing me the basics of logic in NMS. In fact, the very first circuit I ever built was a direct copy of a circuit he showed in a video. I'll link his channel on screen, go subscribe now. The other creator I consider to be the pinnacle of logic builders in NMS. They go by the name of Nolinder. They've built a working computer in-game, for crying in a bucket. I'll link their channel on screen now. Now back to why I'm making these videos. I'm hoping that they'll be helpful to players who, like myself, lack any sort of electrical background. I'll try to explain things in ways that make sense to me, and hopefully will make sense to you as well. For this first episode, we're going to start super simple. First, let's meet all the players in the NMS logic game. There are 4 triggers and 2 logic switches. The triggers are called switches, but thinking of them as something that triggers the circuit makes more sense to me. The 4 triggers are buttons, wall switches, proximity switches, and floor switches. All 4 triggers have 2 ports, an input and an output. Input is where the current comes into the piece, and output is where the current comes out of the piece when it triggers. The 2 ports are interchangeable as well. Let's look at each piece a little bit closer. A button sends a single pulse of current when it's pressed, and then has to be pressed again to send another pulse. A wall switch will send a steady current when turned on. The on and off state of a wall switch is independent of whether it is powered or not. That means that if a wall switch is flipped to on, cutting the power to the switch will stop the flow of current. However, if the switch is left in the on position, resupplying the power will resume the current without you having to interact with the wall switch again. Proximity switches allow current to flow through when you're close to them and stop the flow when you move further away. Floor switches are actually proxy switches in that they allow current to flow when you get close to them, not by pressure from you actually standing on them. Now let's look a little closer at the proxy versus floor switches. I mentioned that floor switches are activated by proximity just like proxy switches. They can also be activated by standing on them. The only time this matters is when using sphere generators. A sphere generator will trigger a floor switch, but will not trigger a proxy switch. This is true even if the floor switch isn't on the floor and the ball doesn't run over it. Another idiosyncrasy with these two switches is that sizing the proxy switch has no effect on the detection bubble at all, while sizing the floor switch has an inverse effect on its detection radius. By this, I mean that small floor switches have a bigger detection radius than normal-sized ones. The left floor switch is normal-sized. See as how I get further away? The normal-sized floor switch turns off before the small floor switch even further away on the right. Now let's talk about the last two pieces, the logic switches. These are the power inverter and auto switch. Unlike the triggers, these both have 3 ports. The ports are input, output, and control. Input and output are the same as with the triggers, are located on opposite sides of the switch, and are interchangeable. The control is what determines if current is passed or not. These two work exactly opposite. The power inverter always passes current through unless the control is powered. If there is current flowing into the control, no current is passed through to the output. The auto switch is exactly opposite. It doesn't pass current unless the control is powered. Just like so. Now that we've covered all the different players in the NMS logic game, let's finish up this episode with a couple basic ways to utilize them in your builds. Let's start with doors. Both the regular prefab door and power doors are open when unpowered and closed when powered. At first, this seems backwards to most players, but this was done for a very specific reason. The devs at Hello Games realized that if you were to visit another player's base or even your own, if the power didn't render in and the doors were closed when unpowered, you'd find yourself trapped. This way, if the power doesn't render in, you can go through the doors with impunity and not be trapped. However, this does make the doors a bit tougher to use, since if you simply hook them up to a proxy switch, they close when you get close, not open. This means you need an additional piece, the power inverter. If you remember, the power inverter passes power through unless the control is powered. So if you run a wire from a power source to the input of the inverter, and then a wire from the output to the door, power will be passed through and the door will be shut. Then run a wire from a power source to the proxy switch input, and then a wire from the proxy switch output to the control of the inverter. Once you get close enough to trigger the proxy switch, it then powers the control of the inverter and cuts the power to the doors, causing them to open sesame. You can replace the proxy switch with a wall switch if you want to have something you need to interact with in order to open the door, but a button won't work since it only sends a pulse, which will cut the power inverter for just a second, and then it will power back up, closing the door. Now another easy way to use switches is to make day-night switches. Say you've got a base with pit lights and you want the lights to come on at night and shut off during the day. Wire all the pit lights together and then attach them to the output of a power inverter. Wire the input to a power source. Finally, place a solar panel and wire it into the control of the inverter. While the sun is out and the solar panel is putting out power, the inverter is cut and the lights stay off. Once the solar panel closes and stops putting out power, let there be light. Finally, let's finish off with how to build a blinking light. For this, let's put down a light panel with a decal. Now we run a wire from the output of a power inverter to the panel, and a wire from the input to a power source. The panel is now lit up. But if we run a wire from the output to the control, the panel starts blinking. Well, that's gonna do it for the first episode of Electrified by Enra. I appreciate you coming by and watching the video. Hopefully you found something useful. If you did, please do the YouTube things. Check back soon for episode 2, where we'll cover how to make flashing lights, and we'll start to look at how to combine switches to make more complex functions. I'm Enra Silver, and I'll see you around the verse.